In a traditional courtroom, the goal is adversarial. It's me versus you. It's my evidence against yours. There's a winner, there's a loser, and there's a rope that's pulled until eventually it snaps and one or both sides fall on their asses. We've been conditioned to think that this is the only way to solve a problem, by defeating the person on the other side of it. But in our lives, whether we are in a boardroom or at the kitchen table, a tug of war is a race to the bottom. When you try to win against your partner, your co-founder, or your child, even if you win, the relationship loses. So what if we stopped pulling at the rope and started looking at the ground that we're standing on? Today, my guests, Jillian Yuhas and Jan Yuhas, are here to make a case for a different kind of litigation. They call it the we mindset. It's a shift from being opponents to being co-architects. After this, we'll return. Jillian and Jan will enter the courtroom to make the case for the we mindset. Today, we're putting a framework on the record that changes the geometry of conflict. I first connected with today's guests through their Substack, High Stakes Conversations, where they break down the psychological strategy between how we talk to each other when the stakes are high. Jillian and Jan are the founders of 28, where they help executives and individuals navigate the kind of friction that can derail a company or a home. They're also the authors of the book, Boundary Badass, a powerful method for elevating your value in relationships. Jillian, Jan, welcome to the Case For. I'm glad that you're both here. As an attorney, I have spent decades of my life in the world of litigation, which is the epitome of me versus you or we versus they. And it's really, really brutal. I did it for a long time. I don't do it any longer. I'm now an in-house attorney. But one of the reasons I got away from it was I felt like no matter what the outcome was, somebody always had to lose. So as a result, the work that the two of you have done on co-creation grabbed my attention almost immediately. So before we jump into the case that you're here to make today, I would love for our listeners to meet you both. As we just discussed, you're twins. You are psychological strategists and you're mediators. So give us a little bit of background on the world you live in and how you came to build the Boundary Badass method.
So she and I, being twins, and being in business partners together, we've always sort of had to consider the other person's perspective or their thoughts when making joint decisions. And so often we would have to have these conversations, but then we would notice people in our lives in terms of the conflict that they would be facing because they would constantly be faced with having to make independent decisions. And so that can often lead, when you don't have someone on your side or someone you're collaborating with, it can feel like you're against this like war. And so for us, when making decisions as business partners, we're like, we have something different than what the average person sort of experiences because they don't have a twin where you always have to consider the other person's perspective. So it forces you to actually have to work together, which is sort of how we developed this like we mindset. With our background and masters in psychology, certified mediators, it sort of was innate for us, I would say, growing up too. I think our parents really enforced working together and creating this fairness and being on the same team versus competing with each other.
Okay, I'll say I know a few sets of twins, and the business and the profession and career that the two of you have built together definitely stands out to me. If I think about the couple sets of twins that I know most, the first opportunity they have to kind of run in the opposite direction from the other, they do that. And that's not to speak of, their love for their sibling. There's obviously a bond there, but there's also a sense of wanting to establish that individuality. So your decision together to set out and create this business I'm intrigued for sure. But I can absolutely see how you've taken that experience that's unique to your relationship and said, hey, listen, yeah, we have an up close and, front row seat to these dynamics because we're twins. And obviously your business isn't catered to talking to twins, but it's approaching professional and personal relationships through that very unique lens that you have.
Yeah, I think she and I do have our individual personalities, but I would say we do have a lot of similarities. So like, it's not that we don't butt heads from time to time because we do think differently. Like she's a detail-oriented thinker. I'm a big picture thinker. So sometimes, yes, we do have differences in terms of how we approach situations or problems at times, but we can benefit from each other because we are able to see outside of our own thinking patterns and figure out how we're going to bridge the gap.
So I know that some of your background is in psychology. Is that what each of you has studied along the educational path in your lives?
Yes.
Okay. And did you guys attend the same university or did you go to different schools?
We have all
No,
the same
same
education and went to school together at the same exact time. Yes.
Okay. I'm loving, by the way, this answering questions in unison. It really drives home the we mindset. Now that we know who you both are and kind of what brought you to this point and the decisions that you've made to start your business in 28, I'd love for you to make an opening statement. So as I've mentioned, I'm an attorney. I spent 11 years as a litigator and 2 years prior to that as a prosecutor. So I spent the first 13 years of my career in courtrooms. And, if you've seen the legal movies or TV shows, you give your opening statement, then you present evidence in support of your opening statement. You might have to deal with an objection or two, and then you make a closing argument. It's that impassioned, ladies and gentlemen, you're sitting on the edge of your seat. This is what I want you to take home. So that's the structure loosely of how I want to get into the case you're here to make today. And so with that, Jillian, Jan, let's have you start to make an opening statement for the case for the we mindset. Tell us who this case is for and what's the promise of what we will realize if we stop fighting each other and start collectively fighting a problem.
So I think the case is when we co-create mutually beneficial agreements, everybody walks away feeling like they've gained something, even though they may give up a little bit of something in that process. Being able to negotiate back and forth allows people to both feel somewhat at ease, knowing that they were able to achieve an agreement that both parties feel successful with. I think when we are able to co-create, we just create this like win-win outcome. And like I said, both people feel more inclined to honor that partnership, that relationship or connection, knowing that there was a successful process that took place, because it shows self-respect and mutual respect simultaneously.
So can you give me an example of a situation? It can be personal to you guys, or it can be something that you've done with someone you work with through your business where, you or your client was approaching something from a me versus you perspective, and you guys were able to step in successfully and help them reevaluate the frame, and then as a result lead to a mutually beneficial outcome.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to helping our clients succeed, if they're personally facing conflict with one of their clients, we try to help them see outside of their perspective and say, how do you think this other person is going to receive this email or this conversation? Like, have you thought about how the both of you are going to bridge the gap between those perspectives? Because often more people are on the defense and want to win or feel like they need to constantly
Or
gain
prove a point.
yeah, or gain something versus thinking, how does this work for that partnership? So looking at the big picture, but we're negotiating the details in the big picture.
With that, I think we have a clear understanding of the case and the approach that the two of you take in your business and personally into conflict resolution. Let's talk about the exhibits. So what I'll do is I'll introduce an exhibit. I'll put a little bit of background to it, and then I would love for you guys to expand and elaborate on how you see that and how it fits into your bigger picture. So the first one, you just touched on it. It's kind of the pivot from viewing every person as an opponent to viewing people as a partner. And so the shift, as we talked about a few minutes ago, is from me versus you to we versus the problem. So in my professional life, I manage the legal function for a large company, and I have seen negotiations with clients, partners, investors stall because both sides become really focused on winning. And what winning means obviously can take a different form depending on the circumstance. But at the end of the day, I believe the mindset is I have to win, and as a result, you have to lose, versus let's find a common ground. And in my experience, as I mentioned earlier, as a litigator, I would handle cases where my client would say, we want to sue them because they did X. And it might be years of, trying to demonstrate to a court, a judge, or a jury that we should win. 99% of those cases would be resolved in a settlement. And a settlement, the spirit of a settlement is It's a resolution of the problem. And so the parties have to come together and sit down and say, okay, what's really important to me? What's really important to you? Where can I give? Where can you give? And that is much more collaborative. So it's funny that in litigation, what starts as an all-out battle almost always resolves in a cooler set of heads prevailing to sit down and say, how do we address this? So, when the minute you stop thinking about winning and you start thinking about what are you trying to build, I think that's a huge pivot point. Talk to us, though, in your experience and from your perspective, how do we actually stop seeing that person across the table as soon as possible as an obstacle and start seeing them as a partner? Because it's very emotional in my experience. And that's a big part of it, because when you feel emotional, it feels personal and it attacks your identity. And if the other person's on the other side of that, it's a lot harder to empathize with that person when you view them as the person standing in the way of what you want.
But if we can get out of our emotions, then we can indirectly also guide the conversation to a resolution by asking discovery questions or assessing where there's a misunderstanding or disconnect within the relationship. But many times when we get we're operating from our ego, we're operating from our emotions, we're only focused on our outcome. So that's driving the control, the outcome. Instead, we want to come from our value-based perspective, such as what is the common, because values are universally understood, where emotions are one-sided projections onto that connection. So our values allow us to create a foundation of operation within the dynamic and help us find mutual ground. And when we're in our values, we are from a heart-centered thinking in terms of how we want to approach this problem. So that allows us to come from a more collaborative angle in terms of approaching the situation. And also, we're going to have much more greater understanding between both parties because, like I said, values are universally understood. So when we have the value of, whether it's growth within the company or whether it's like time or communication, whatever the bigger objective goal is, we have to narrow that down to the greater value that we're trying to find. Two independent thoughts are meeting in the middle of the bridge.
So what I'm hearing a few things, but one of which is trying to distance yourself from that emotion as soon as possible because it's blinding. Because I think that, I don't want to say emotion is the enemy of logic, but it sure does get in the way. And it can influence it because it becomes personal or tied up in your own identity or ego. So how do you, and I want to be mindful of the fact that 28 and your clients, you don't want to come on here and start talking about individual conflicts, but maybe perhaps if there's an example for the two of you personally, whether it be with each other or someone else, where you were able to kind of cut through that emotional layer quickly and get to that we mindset where you think our listeners might be able to take some of these concepts and understand them with a bit of texture.
Well, I think at that moment, that's where you can really sort of shut down conflict or intercept it by using a discovery question. So you might say, what are we trying to achieve in this conversation? So it helps the other person pause and think what is the end goal if we keep escalating and arguing back and forth with each other? So if we use a discovery question, it sort of disrupts that dialogue because then you're asking them, what are we gaining? What are we going to achieve at the end? So using that, and I think using we in our discovery question is very vital because it shows that you want to be on the same team or you want to achieve an end goal. And it's not me versus you. It's how are we going to get to that outcome or the end goal? And so using discovery questions, it really disrupts discord immediately because people have to pause and think.
And we're seeking understanding or curiosity about the other person's perspective and what it is that they want to achieve. So then it allows us to start thinking about our perspective or our objectives and how are we going to take their objective and our objective and try to fuse it together to have a mutually objective outcome or agreement.
And so I would imagine that a level of that is being able to, assuming you start to use those discovery questions and you're successful in creating that bridge between you and whoever's sitting on the other side of the table, and you start thinking about if I'm understanding you both correctly, then it allows you to start creating priorities, right? What is your top priority? What is mine? Is there a way to perhaps create that Venn diagram that gets you close to what you want and us close to what we want? And so the idea here isn't set aside your own personal incentives and your needs. It's just approach them through a lens that's collaborative rather than all out warfare.
Yes. Yeah, you're this leader who's trying to lead the conversation towards a collaborative discussion or one that's cohesive where each person is seen respectfully, but also, like you said, you're trying to simultaneously honor that connection too, as well.
And some of the reading I've done on your Substack and just about the two of you and your business, I've seen the term co-creation referenced a lot. Can you talk a little bit about, the theory of co-creation, what that is?
So co creation is where we are really bridging the gap, like we've mentioned, between two different perspectives. So, like, you can't reach the agreement unless both people have a voice and a choice in it. Because if you want people to actually honor that agreement, both people have to feel like they had some kind of input. Otherwise, they're going to feel like they're being told to uphold this agreement, which often leads to resentment or leads to underlying issues down the road because they may not uphold it because they had no choice. So when people have a voice and a choice, they feel valuable, they feel respected, they feel heard. And so when both people are doing that, both parties, it creates this co-creation where there's a mutual benefit for both parties in the end goal.
So neither party feels like it's happening to them. They both feel like they have an active voice and where you're going. I think I'm a big analogy guy. I think it's the former trial lawyer in me. When I think about sometimes disagreements I'm having, whether that be with a colleague, a partner, a client, a child, a family member, I think, and I'm sure most people don't think about it this way, but for me, this has always helped. If you're in a vehicle, you're in a car, and someone's driving and someone's riding in the passenger seat. And the idea, it sounds like here, this co-creation is both people should feel like they have a hand on the wheel, because then when you arrive at a destination, it feels like you weren't forced to go there by the person who's driving. You actually had a say in how you got there, and you took the road that made sense and maybe didn't give you everything you were looking for. But again, it felt less like it was happening to you and more like it was something you were collaborating on to make happen. Is that a good encapsulation of that idea?
Yeah, you can have one person driving, but then the other person, they might be lost if they don't have directions. So they're relying on the other person to give them directions at the same time. So you have to work together cohesively in order to get to where you're going at the end of the day. So
Okay.
each person
Yeah,
can,
that's probably safer. I don't think it's probably
yeah,
safe
it
to have
might
two
be a
people with
little,
their hands on the wheel. Yeah,
but
I
each
think,
person
right. It's
might
a
bring a
theoretical
different,
idea. I'm
yeah,
sorry, go
each
ahead.
person might bring a different strength to the actual, negotiation or the agreement in order to get to where they're going together.
Which also creates
Yeah.
psychological safety within the dialogue and the dynamic because both people, like you said, get to have some kind of value that they bring to that relationship because obviously we are going to value a relationship if it's also valuable or meaningful to ourselves.
And we're also
Okay.
creating trust in that dynamic. One person is trusting the person who's driving the car to get them there and driving safely, whatnot. And the driver's also depending on the other person that they're trusting them to provide the correct directions
Yeah,
as well.
turn right here. So it's truly like you're outsourcing a bit of your agency, but in doing so,
Mhm.
you're allowing both people to feel like their voice matters. So,
Yep.
Yep.
much better, much better analogy than two people trying to turn the wheel in opposite directions. So, that's why you guys are the experts here, and I'm just asking questions. All right, so let's talk about Exhibit B. So around this one, I think about value over emotion. And I think this is a big part of in reading about your book, which I have not had a chance to read yet, but I will be, the boundary badass method. So speaking from a place of value and not emotionally, I think we touched on that just now with Exhibit A. I'm still learning actively about leadership. I've been an executive at two companies over the last 6 years. And there are things that I do well. There are things that I am learning about painfully and actively on a daily basis. And the same is true as a dad. I've got three kids who are 16, 12, and 7. Um, in both of those settings, I know how easy it is to let emotion grab that proverbial wheel that we were just talking about. Your method argues for honoring your own individual worth while simultaneously honoring that relationship. I can tell you that those are nice concepts. I could see that being a struggle for me, which probably means I just need to be more self-aware of it in the moment and not let that guide me to the wrong place. So how do the two of you train people to separate their worth from their emotions, especially in the middle of like the heat and the emotion of a high stakes conversation?
So if we are operating from our emotions, we're actually disconnected from our values in that moment. And so it's not that we want to suppress our emotions, because that's not healthy either, but we need to recognize and have awareness of our emotions. So if we're in that moment, we're having a disagreement, whether with a colleague or it could be a child or whoever, like if we're feeling triggered, emotionally triggered, that is our cue to take care of you. So we might want to pause. This might not be a good time to have a conversation if we're emotionally heightened at that point in time. And that triggers, such as say we feel disrespected. The opposite of that is the value that we need to seek in order to find resolution. So the opposite of disrespected might be mutual respect. If we feel ignored, we might need to ask for communication. If we need a timeout to collect ourselves and emotionally regulate, then we might ask for personal space. So our emotions are cues of what we need to do, and what we need to ask for is the opposite as a value in order to find the alignment within that connection. So it's not that if we're in an emotional state, we're just adding, like, for example, another analogy, we're adding fuel to the fire and it's going to spread like a wildfire. If we're trying to have a conversation and we're in an emotional state, we're not going to be able to reach a common ground more than likely. So we do need to emotionally regulate before we try to problem solve.
I'm going to use myself as the patient here. So I think about, as an attorney for 20 years, I've been involved in probably every specific type of professional conflict, always on behalf of my clients, not personally, thankfully, but on behalf of my clients. And emotions get high, especially the first time you're kind of stepping into that arena with the person who's on the other side of the table. What is something I can do, or somebody who's listening who might have that same default setting? Because listen, I know I'm at a point in my life where I know that leading with only emotion is not going to put you somewhere good, most likely. And if you do get there, it's probably a coincidence rather than the emotion guiding you to the right place, because there's so many things tied up in that emotion. And so what's something I can do the next time I'm on a call for work and I feel my engine overheating, to self-regulate and remind myself, hey, don't look at it through that lens, or take a step back and depersonalize this and re-engage in these other ways. What do you think might be helpful for someone like me?
Well, I think for yourself is sometimes it can also be helpful to recognize the other person's emotions that are escalating yours. So you might try to label their experience. Say, it seems like this was really painful, or this seems like this is very frustrating for you. And so you're trying to acknowledge their emotions, which also is going to help them potentially maybe calm down a bit, because then they feel validated.
They feel heard and understood, which is a human. Everyone wants to feel heard and understood at the end of the day.
Yeah. So if you're labeling or recognizing their emotional expression and just like, it seems like you're really frustrated, and I want to make sure I get all the facts together of what it is that we need to present. So let's slow down a bit here and just guide them. That's also going to take your emotions and drop your escalation of how you feel or heightened emotion, because you're now focused on guiding them through that process, which then also helps you sort of regulate. But another skill or tool to use in that moment, if you're feeling very triggered by your client, is just to do some deep belly breathing. And that can just really help calm the nervous system. And most people are not going to hear or see you do that, because you're really just focused on expanding the belly in that moment. And it can really work easily on conversations or calls. I've used it myself. So
I have a 7-year-old daughter, and I actively encourage her to belly breathe. I actually bought her this thing that glows, and it glows and it helps. She's an anxious child. I think just that's who she is. And it always works. And it's funny that as you're saying that, I was thinking to myself, have I ever used that? And I have not. And so I should probably start. Maybe I'll get myself one of those glowing little orbs. But what I hear you saying, both of you, is you need to set down this idea that this is all about me and what I need. And you need to think, hey, where's their headspace at? And I feel like one of the things that does, not only is it a bridge to the we mindset and it helps you put yourself in their shoes, I also feel like it would maybe deactivate them, to your point about people wanting to feel validated or seen. Even in a context of a business or work, people have their identities wrapped up in that. And there's a feeling of, I want to do a good job. I want to earn my paycheck. I want to be successful. I want to be respected. And so if somebody feels like they're losing, they may feel like the surface level optics are they've made a mistake. And that's not always true. Sometimes people end up at a conflict, not because somebody did something wrong, but maybe they didn't have a conversation earlier about expectations. And so I really think the point that you made about asking questions, for me personally, I can see that taking me outside of myself momentarily. And it has a benefit for me to be able to let the emotions subside, but also for the person that I'm talking to feel like I'm inviting them into the car and saying, hey, let's figure out what path we're going to take and let's get there together. So um, I assume this is stuff that is elaborated on in your book. And I was already looking forward to reading it. I would imagine if this is where the book spends a lot of its time, I cannot pick it up soon enough. So
Yeah, and you bring up a good point in terms of expectations. So expectations are one-sided perspectives, again, that from our ego or our emotions that we're projecting onto the relationship. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there when it comes to expectations versus like standards or like boundaries. If we're gonna expectations are going to lead to us to constantly be disappointed. So we want to focus on the standard that we're trying to achieve within the relationship, such as our values or the boundaries we're trying to like set. Because otherwise, expectations, no one's going to be able to ever meet your expectations because they don't know what your expectations are. It's usually unspoken,
many people have heard the saying, expectation is the enemy of joy, right? When you expect something from someone, you're almost asking to be let down because
Yeah.
to your point just now, if you're not telling that person what you're expecting, that's step one. And there's a vulnerability in that. And it's like, well, if I don't ever say it out loud and they don't meet them, well, you know what? It just wasn't meant to be versus I've said it out loud. They're not meeting my expectations. That must tell me what they feel about my value to them or in this
Not
situation. So,
necessarily.
okay.
Even if you express your expectations to someone, they may not agree with your expectations because that's just your thought process. That's where you're coming from. It doesn't mean that they don't want to like work with you. It's that's not their standard or their value in terms of how they operate or what in terms of how they want to approach the situation. So if you think about it from like a business standpoint, or even maybe your daughter, for example, if you say, I expect you to like be at the dinner table at 6 o'clock every day, but maybe she's not like hungry at 6 o'clock. Rather like, okay, Dad, can we have dinner at 6:30 instead or whatever? So if you have such rigid they come from very rigid black and white thinking patterns typically, which is our fixed mindset. And so that's why we get disappointed or let down because we haven't been able to figure out collaboratively what time does everyone want to meet for the dinner table to have dinner.
But that sounds like exactly like the we mindset, right?
Yeah.
Versus I'm the parent, I want to eat at 6 o'clock. And if my daughter doesn't show up at 6 o'clock, that's disrespectful. That's a very personalized way to interpret that. And I can absolutely, now that you've just walked through it, see how the healthier approach might be. Okay, well, what would work for you in a way that allows you to sit down at the table when you're expected to, but also considers the fact that you're not hungry at 6 o'clock. So,
Yeah, so we give options to choose from is usually how we work in those situations. So
yeah,
just
because
like,
it makes the other person feel like they have a say.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. All
And
right. Well, I'm
respect in the dynamic.
I'm going to steal that like immediately. So thank you.
Mhm.
I not steal the idea and say it's mine, but just I'm going to be using that left and right because that is something that I think I do in areas of my life. But when I think about my kids, there's almost this preconceived notion that I have, and I'm sure it's a product of how I was raised, that I'm the parent, I'm in charge, I set the rules. And maybe when you have a 5-year-old and they need to brush their teeth before bed, like, yeah, it's okay to have that rule, but 90% of life is kind of gray and you need to be more flexible and giving them options. I feel like make them feel like a partner in that relationship. And I'm excited to see how what kind of value that'll yield with my kids. I'm hopeful. So
Yeah, you're also strengthening their inner voice and their ability to articulate and develop confidence within themselves and their self-worth by giving them choices.
I love that. I
Mhm.
truly I love that. All right. So let's talk about Exhibit C. This one is the negotiated agreement. So it's all about building partnerships through mutually respectful agreements. So in a courtroom, a judge hands down his or her ruling. In your world, the ruling is something that optimally is co-created through a negotiation. So we just talked about my daughter, as a father of 3, I have realized, and again, this is almost exactly on point with what you just mentioned, because I said so, and that model of parenting is not effective. And that's how I was raised. and my parents are amazing and they've evolved, but it was just the product of that generation. And
Exactly.
kids these days realize, hey, I deserve to have a voice in this too. And the fact that I'm younger than you doesn't mean that my opinions don't matter. How do we apply the we mindset to negotiations, whether we're talking about two executives at a company or a family dynamic?
Well, I think this is where, like I said, we're trying to have an open dialogue and we're trying to assess like what does each party need in order to achieve this like end goal. And so if you and your colleague are on opposite ends of the spectrum, like they're on A and you're on Z, but we got to get to the middle around M or N, in order to get there, we're going to have this open dialogue to understand your belief system and narrative and what their belief system and narrative is. Because if you have two people from different upbringings, they're not going to have the same perspective or the same end goal often. And so in ways, we're just trying to learn about people and understand them, because then that's what allows people to actually want to have this fluid conversation, and they're less likely to feel like they have to put up this defense or resort to coping mechanisms where they may shut down or completely, disagree with you at all costs, which doesn't really indicate to create this gridlock. So the end goal here is really just having an open discussion where there's mutual respect and self-respect for yourself. But you can even use I statements and we statements where you're really owning your truth and value, but also getting their perspective on that, which doesn't diminish your value. You're only just trying to negotiate a point to get to the end goal.
Yeah, so we need to have a little bit of cognitive flexibility if we're going to be able to reach an agreement. And so that allows us to understand our own thought processes, other people's thought process as well. So we're not, I think when people get into that defensive mode, it's like me versus you. They're attacking that person, or it's like defending themselves as a person, like we kind of touched on earlier. And instead, we want to understand their approach to the problem. How are they thinking about this problem? Because that's usually where we can find resolution, is that we might be saying the exact same thing. We're just saying it completely different ways. So we need to get into the nitty gritty of the approach that they're taking or the thought process behind it.
And I think, too, really having active listening skills is key. The more we listen, the more we learn and gain in terms of the direction the conversation needs to go. Because if we're just doing all the talking and we're not actually actively listening, then it's going to be hard to actually get to the result that we want.
Interesting. So I heard a few moments ago, you mentioned I statements versus we statements. Can you give anybody listening an example of, in a situation where you're focused on resolving conflict through the we mindset, when would an I question or an I statement be appropriate, and when would you default to a more we-minded approach?
Well, you want to use both of those. So you might say, I feel misunderstood when bringing up project A. I value open discussion. Can we talk about this? The reason why you want to use I and we is because you're owning your truth, but you're also trying to gain them and bring them into the conversation because you want them to lean in. And the biggest thing is we just don't want to use you statements, because you said you're not understanding me right this minute. That they're going to feel attacked and blamed, and so why would they want to engage with you? So it's very crucial and critical to use those I and we to collaboratively together throughout your communication and really avoid the you statements.
You also don't want to
Okay.
ask why questions either,
Yeah.
from a psychological perspective. So you might say, well, why did you choose that? Or why do you think that that's the best route? So again, why questions, they feel attacked, that their way of
Judged.
approaching it is not the right way, rather than, can you help me understand how come we're approaching it this way? Or what thought process went behind taking this action? So again, we're trying to understand them as a person, rather than, like she said, they might feel judged if you ask why they took that approach.
So, in hearing the you piece of it makes complete sense to me, because
Mhm.
you is generally followed by some sort of statement that is either judgmental or feels judgmental. And so you're putting somebody on their heels and their walls go up, which is collaborative. And
Yep.
then the why and the you piece jumped out at me the minute you started saying it. I was like, oh, I get that. I've seen
Mhm.
that. I probably have had that thought. The why question, as a lawyer, every other thing I say to somebody is why, because it's not personal. It's like, I want to get to the heart of understanding this. But to your point, the psychological shift in asking someone why, what you're essentially saying to them is, well, you need to convince me, or you need to defend why this is the right thing to do, or why. And I can see how when people have asked me why, I feel like I'm on the stand in a trial, and that's not a good feeling. You're feeling attacked and you're under the microscope. So really helpful. So the takeaways here, I'm a very like, come up with rules, park them in my brain and move on. So it's about it's about I when you're talking about your feelings, and avoiding you and avoiding why questions. And not to say that you can't ask questions or probe around somebody's belief set or their position, but leading with why can cause people's walls to go up pretty quickly.
Yeah, also usually in a business setting, even though in terms of like our boundary method, we don't usually get into saying like, I feel disrespected. So that's more for personal relationships or like family. In business, we say it seems there's a disconnect. It seems like we're not on the same page here. So we're getting a little bit more from personalizing it and focusing more on the bigger picture of the disconnect in the business relationship.
It's observational in a business setting. Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Okay. And yeah, that tracks with my experience. A lot of, and I know corporate speak gets a lot of flack in social media and things like that. But there are ways to say things that I think are easier because it gets a conversation or the fact finding or the discovery questions off on the right foot. So I've definitely used that myself, which is, it seems as though, and you're talking about the whole of the group rather than
Yes.
why are you taking that position? Don't you care about our business or, whatever. That is the gasoline that you mentioned earlier on the fire.
Yeah, depersonalizing it is all about it seems or it appears. Like that's the easiest way to bring up an issue or a problem or something that you feel is not getting to the end goal as a team. And so it really allows both people to feel like they can actually communicate and not feel like it's an intense conversation. Because most people avoid conflict, and we don't want and even though there's already a problem we have to solve, we don't want the problem to escalate to greater conflict, because then a lot of people just feel uncomfortable. And we learned that just through how growing up in the home environment, or how people deal with conflict is often how people deal with it in the workplace too.
Yeah, it's a learned behavior. There's no question about it. I've seen the good habits and the bad habits that I picked up growing up in a family of 5, for better or worse, manifest in the workplace. And so sometimes I have to catch myself. But I know the two of you have background in psychology. My undergraduate degree is in psychology. And so I remember studying about like child psychology and learned behavior and conditioning and things like that. And, even at the ripe old age of 47, I still find myself trying to deprogram myself from some of the behaviors that I picked up along the way that are less than ideal. So that one definitely rings close to home.
I think we all kind of have to go through, if you have a growth mindset, we all kind of go through that process of deprogramming ourselves, because no matter what home environment you grew up in, you're still going to bring something from that into your way of thinking and your belief system. So.
Yeah, good or bad, right? There's just no way around it. There's no way you live that reality for 18 years or whatever that looks like and not have it influence who you become when you step out into the adult world. So,
yeah, because most of our belief systems are actually developed by age 7.
Yeah. Well, that's horrifying. But good to know. So, all right, ladies, the next part, we walked through the evidence, really great conversation. The next part is going to be objections. I'm going to lob a couple of objections at you both. Whoever feel free to both speak to them. But these are the things that when I started reading your Substack and some of the things you had posted, I could imagine. I happen to be, I think, I'm not someone, the jury's not out on me. A lot of the things that the two of you write about and speak about, I believe those things. I have found my way into that mind of collaborative conflict resolution. But a lot of people don't view it that way. A lot of people hear this probably and think like, oh, this is touchy-feely 2026. Everybody's, and I disagree. Like that's just, even if it was painted that way, the bottom line is this is the way the world is moving. And the way that the two of you talk about conflict resolution is how human beings, I think, show up day to day in relationships and at work. So the first objection that I have is a very clear one. And I have worked with a lot of lawyers in my career. Lawyers as a whole have big egos. And I can imagine a lawyer listening to this right now and saying, okay, this sounds great in concept, but isn't what you're advocating for essentially just a version of giving in? How do you react to that?
We're not giving in. So when it comes to, because like we said, we're not we are not foregoing our own value. We're still recognizing our own value and our needs that need to be met while simultaneously looking to bridge the gap and come to a resolution. So if they say that you're giving in, that would be more like a people pleaser sort of mentality or an avoidant attachment mentality. Also, they're avoiding conflict. So those people might appear agreeable on the surface and they're like giving in, but that's because they're not advocating for their voice. They're not creating a choice. They're just appeasing the other person in order to get by and not cause any rifts or any disconnects within the connection itself. But that builds underlying resentment over time if we're not advocating for our value within the connection. So it's a simultaneously advocating for our own value and our own needs while still negotiating a resolution that works for the relationship as a whole.
I think the biggest thing is you're trying to create this collective truth through collaboration, knowing that if I want to preserve this relationship or partnership, because whatever I decide today could actually impact the next partnership or relationship I may have, because you have to think every conversation you have is also represents your reputation or character as an individual too, which could externally be presented outwardly to other people. So every conversation you have, be intentional with your word, but also you're trying to create resolution because it's important short-term and long-term for your business.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is the reaction, the obviously very well put, but the reaction I was expecting to that objection. It's not about weakness. It's about understanding, we don't live in a time anymore. I don't know that we ever have, but you think about thousands of years ago when people would oppose, a tyrant or a ruler, and like the tyrant would just have that person killed, right? That's not how the world works anymore. So you have to set some of that down. You have to work with the other person. And I think the sooner you realize that in the process of conflict, the quicker you're going to get to an outcome and probably save a lot of people time, money, pain, inefficiency. So the second objection is in that same vintage. Before I ask the question, I'm going to use an example I mentioned earlier. My 11 years as a private trial attorney, I had a lawsuit once that lasted 4 years. From the time that a client first engaged me to when it settled on the courthouse steps, literally standing on the courthouse steps, negotiating millions and millions of dollars of settlement. The case did not fundamentally change from day one and day 1300. The only thing that shifted was the mindset went from to me mindsets to we mindsets, and the stakes and the leverage and the potential pain and cost of going to trial became more of a prevalent consideration. But I used to tell my clients, nothing has changed in these 4 years except you've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on lawyers. And I hear what the two of you are talking about, and I think if they had just adopted the we mindset, maybe not on day one, but on day 50, all of the pain and trouble that could have been saved through that approach. And so this dovetails into this next objection. And I don't agree with this objection, but I can't help but think somebody listening might have it.
Okay.
This we mindset idea, it works if both people have read your book or they both subscribe to this way of thinking. But what if I let my guard down and I'm not trying to build a me case anymore? I'm trying to build a we case, but that other person is out to destroy me. What if they refuse to drop that rope of the tug of war? Don't I then find myself at a disadvantage in the long run? How do you react to that?
Well, I think you have to decide what it's costing you personally by continuing this litigation or this conversation or whatever it is. At some point in time, sometimes if the other person isn't willing to work with us, we have to make a different kind of choice that's going to add value or maintain a certain kind of growth for ourselves. Because we don't want to just constantly feel like we're losing something by trying to convince someone else to work with us. So at some point in time, we have to decide if this person chooses not to work with us, we can't force them, but sometimes giving them space, they come around and realize maybe it is better to create the settlement agreement. So sometimes we just need to pause and let there be space between the dialogue, and give somebody time to actually reflect and think on what it is that they want. And often they will come back around. But if they choose not to, then you have to make the choice for yourself. I need to move on because it's not cost. the cost of staying in this isn't worth it in the end because your self-worth is more valuable to walk away than continue it.
There will be challenging personality types that everyone will come across in life at some point in time. And that person, it's really not even about the war with the other persons, it's about the internal war within themselves.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm reflecting on some of my own, the battles I've fought. And at times it was more my own pride or stubborn ego that prevented me from stepping back and saying, you know what? Like, what are we really trying to do here? And what are we trying to solve for? So what I hear in what both of you have said in response to this objection and throughout the episode is while you can't control somebody else's mindset and force them
Mhm.
to adopt the we mindset, you can lead them there, right? It may not be directly pulling them. It may be, as you mentioned, giving them that space, allowing them to let their better angels prevail and logic to kind of set in and say, hey, you know what? Like, is this really worth it? I have something I have said to my clients my whole career, and people would say, well, I want to go after them, scorched earth and show them and teach them a lesson. And I say, hey, by the way, this is my hourly rate and this is going to get very expensive very quickly. And people say, well, it's the principles of it. And I say, you know what? Principles are great, but principles cost money. And it's if we all sat down and fought every single principled battle, nothing in the world would get accomplished because we'd all be too busy trying to convince everybody else that the way that we see things is the right way. And I think the we mindset is the opposite of that. And that's not to say that you're setting down agency or that you're telling the world, I'll believe whatever you want me to if it means we can get this resolved. But it's not just yanking that rope back and forth. Sometimes it's setting the rope down, inviting the other person over and saying, hey, let's think about this collectively and let's not have ego and emotion get wrapped up in this. And that's leadership, right? That's helping the other person adapt and adopt a different lens. So I love this. I thought I had a good understanding of these concepts from just reading about the two of you. You've opened my eyes to a whole other level of it today. So I really appreciate it. So ladies, the next part of the episode is our closing argument. And so what I want you to imagine is someone's listening. They are stuck in their own me versus you battle in some part of their life, maybe in multiple parts of their lives. And it's wearing them down and they don't know what to do at this point. What do you want them to remember about the we mindset as we conclude this episode here in a few minutes and they start focusing on their own personal situation?
I think it's important for them to identify what they value first and foremost, because if you don't know what you value or what you stand for, it can be hard to make a decision in regards to which direction or choices you need to make. And so often, if we're clouded by our emotion, we can revert back to our values and they can guide us in terms of which direction we need to go for that conversation or relationship. And so, because our emotions are all tied to our values, but when we communicate from a place of value, then we're also aligned to our inner truth. And you need to speak from your truth, not from what maybe looks good or what may feel good either, because you have to deal with that consequence if it's not something that you truly wanted, but you just tried to rescue or save the relationship in that moment. So I think ultimately you have to ask yourself, what am I gaining in this moment? Or what do I value about this relationship or connection? And really start to assess your own thought process in regards to how you feel, but what you think and what you value, and connect all those dots to create your overall understanding of whether or not you need to pursue this relationship and find collaborativeness, and create a co-creation or a mutual agreement with them.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that's my biggest takeaway from this time is remembering why you're in that conflict in the first place and remembering that it's really about a value set and then stepping back from there and thinking about what really matters here, what's a good outcome, and then being willing to compromise in a way that's prioritizes the collective outcome versus walking away with like a trophy or a medal and being able to say, oh, I imposed my will on this person, because that's just not how the world works.
No.
So, all right. So the last part here, we've kind of rested the case. The last part of each episode is kind of stepping out of the courtroom and into the real world. And we've talked a lot about applying these concepts throughout the day. I would recommend anybody listening who wants to know more, pick up the book. Obviously, I'm sure it spends a lot of time talking about these ideas and how to apply them. But ladies, for the listeners here today, let's walk away with, let's call it 2 micro practices. And these are just things people can start doing the minute this episode ends the next time they find themselves in a me versus you situation?
So I think the biggest thing is using your discovery questions, because that helps have curiosity, create connection, but it's also going to disc sort of interrupt discord or disconnects. And so they can be, can you share more about X, or help me understand how come, or what would you like to achieve? So you're really opening up the dialogue, and the questions need to be open ended and not close ended, because if you ask a yes or no question, the conversation may die, and then you're not going to be able to gain the farther insight of what it is that you need to position a mutual agreement. And the other takeaway would be is really have emotional regulation with yourself. Practice it on a daily basis. It doesn't take more than 5 to 10 minutes part of your day, but make sure you do that before you have the conversation. Because if you walk into the conversation and get triggered, it's going to be hard to use your skills or set boundaries and sort of depersonalize what it is that you want, but at the same time try to gain the collective truth. So if you're not in the right state of mind, it's going to be hard to negotiate or think about the end goal, because then you're going to be triggered into thinking about yourself, not what we need to achieve.
Yeah, and I think the final note is that align to your top 5 values in life. So when we have integrity with our values, all of our choices we make on a daily basis, whether personal or professionally, should align to those values. And then because we're in alignment with our truth and we feel good about our decisions.
Okay, here I hear knowing who you are and what's your driving principle. I think about that again, the compass in my hand, right? Where am I trying to go and what's important to me as I get there? And then I think to the 2 points, it sounds like the first micro tool is helping the other person get into the right mindset. And the second tool is, not to oversimplify, the second tool is making sure that you're in the right mindset. And so once you've primed both people, and you've led them to a point of thinking about it collaboratively, you're much more likely to get to a mutually beneficial outcome quicker. So I think they sound so simple when you two explain these ideas, but I've also can think of hundreds of times where I've seen people struggle with what feel like just basic, of course, if you tell someone, oh, by the way, this is a good way to get to an outcome, people are like, oh, absolutely. And then they step into a conflict and all those go out the window. And again, that's because the emotion has the wheel. So
Correct.
We
And
get
that's
stuck in that fight or flight response.
Yeah, and that's why we want it to be simple, because when you are in a heightened state, you need to have a simple process. If you have a complex process, it's going to be hard to take the conversation towards the direction you hope to achieve. So
absolutely. Yeah. You don't want to be pulling out a 26-step list when somebody's challenging you or telling you that you failed at something or that they want something from you that you don't want to give. I want to think about, okay, use we statements and I statements. Don't use you statements and ask why questions, and just help lead that person. And again, you said this earlier, my attachment style I'm getting better, but for a lot of my life, it was anxious. And so when there was conflict, my desire is to just jump in and deal with it. And if the person I'm working against, or with rather, is avoidant, that's not going to lead anywhere good. So sometimes it's about knowing who that person is on the other side and stepping back and giving them a chance to breathe and let logic sink in. So really, really helpful insight.
Yeah, and the more you know about somebody's personality or attachment style or how they operate, that is the insight to help you also work with yourself to work better with them too. So.
Yeah, what's going to trigger me? What's going to trigger them? What's going to cause one of us to shut down or get overly emotional? Absolutely. That's something I've spent the last few years in my own life working on personally and professionally. And a lot of it is just the awareness of it. And it's not having a roadmap necessarily, but it's knowing who's sitting across the table and not just viewing that person as like an amorphous blob.
As usually our attachment style determines how we handle conflict.
For me, for sure. There's no question about it. So, well, Jillian and Jan, thank you so much for joining me, for the work that you're doing at 28 Consultancy, and for bringing the We Mindset to the podcast today. I feel very confident and safe speaking for anybody who's listening, saying you've opened my eyes into new ways and really simple ways. Not to diminish the work that you've done in the book that you wrote, but to your point, these things have to be simple. They have to be something you can pull out of your pocket in the midst of like a whirlwind of emotion and apply quickly without having to over-engineer it. So really, truly appreciate the conversation today. Anybody listening, thank you for spending the time with us. If you want to dive deeper into Jillian and Jan's work, check out their book, Boundary Badass, and you can find them on Substack at High Stakes Conversations. Before we wrap, ladies, anything you want to share with our listeners about where they can find you, or if they have any questions and want to reach out directly, what's the best way to do so?
You can head over to 28consultancy.com, or like I said, you can message us on High Stake Conversations Substack.
Wonderful. And I will include contact info and these websites in the show notes on the podcast when I go ahead and post them on Spotify and Apple and all those places. So this has been the case for the We Mindset. If you're listening and this episode reached you or made you think about a tug of war that you're currently in your life, I would love for you to help spread the word about the conversation today and the concepts that Jan and Jillian take to heart in their business. Subscribe to The Case For with Matthew Campobasso on your podcast network. Share it with somebody who's currently fighting a person when they should be fighting a problem. And remember, whatever your case is, don't be afraid to build it and carry it out into the real world.